Obrigado, Carlota, a primeira vez dentro do nosso evento. Estará discutindo sobre IoT, uma abordagem do ecossistema. Então, muito obrigado também pela Rapid7 por disponibilizar seu tempo conosco e para compartilhar o conhecimento. Carlota, é com você. Obrigado.
Raphael, thank you so much for having me. My name is Carlota Bindner, and I am going to be talking about IoT security testing, an ecosystem-based approach. A little bit about me. I'm a security analyst at Rapid7. I am a graduate and mentor of the SANS Women's Cyber Academy. I hold my GPEN, GWAPT, and a number of other industry certifications. I do a lot of community involved work, including Rapid7 goes to different conferences such as DEF CON and RSA, and we hold hands-on exercises focused around IoT and getting people the opportunity to experience a little bit, about what it's like to test IoT and the common vulnerabilities. I also spoke at RSA 2019. I was a co-presenter in U-Boot iHack, a talk focused on U-Boot security. Before we get started, I think a really good place to begin is let's define what is an IoT device. A lot of people think when they think IoT device, they imagine consumer devices, an Amazon Alexa or a Samsung smart fridge, something along those lines. But IoT technology, IoT devices are in a wide range of different parts of our lives. Many people don't think about that multifunction printer that's in their office as an IoT device, but it does meet the following criteria. Embedded technology, it's internet capable, and there's usually a management and control interface, especially multifunction printers. They frequently have a web application that's hosted internally on the company's network for management and being able to interface with the multifunction printer. But it goes far beyond that now. Many offices now have sensors for tracking space usage. HVAC systems are interconnected to provide ease of operation and decreased energy consumption. So IoT is far more than just the consumer devices that people think of on a regular basis. Now that we have an idea of what an IoT device may be, whether that's a smart washer or a internet connected HVAC system, why are we looking at doing an ecosystem testing? What's the benefit of being able to test not just the device, which is one way we could go, and when we're doing security testing, is just focusing on what are the vulnerabilities and security issues with the device itself. But the reason we are using IoT, what the benefit of it is the fact that it is connected to the internet. And there's so many different facets of it. There's that command and control that allows us to easily change it. Think about like a smart thermostat where you're out and about and you have your mobile phone and you can change the temperature in your house. When it comes to internet connected cameras, they have cloud service and APIs and storage up in the cloud, so you can access the images remotely. So if we don't consider the security of that whole ecosystem, all the different components, including the command and control interface, the cloud API, the web application, the mobile application, we can't properly understand what the threat landscape of the IoT device is. So ecosystem testing provides a holistic approach as opposed to just focusing on the device itself. So a nice outline for what an IoT security testing methodology is to begin with functional testing of the device. This allows us to do mapping of the attack surface. That when I say functional testing, that's just setting the device up and being able to use it as its intent in its intended purpose without really focusing on trying to find the vulnerabilities in the system yet. Next, we go into reconnaissance and open source intelligence gathering, where we're trying to see what information is out there and publicly available about the device that a malicious actor would be able to easily access. Next, we move into security testing of the IoT ecosystem. And that's the penetration testing part, where we're looking at testing the security of the mobile app, the device, the web application, and any other components that we've identified as part of the ecosystem. And finally, then we go into analysis of the findings, and we develop, is there an attack path? What different vectors did we identify for the vulnerabilities, and possibly maybe inform further testing of the ecosystem. Functional testing of the IoT ecosystem is focused on, we need to have a lab configured to mimic a real-world deployment. That means if this is a consumer device, we're looking at hooking it up to a small office home wireless router, having it set up in the environment that it's intended to function in. If that's a corporate device, we're going to usually look at hooking it up to different switches and routers, trying to set up a small corporate network, so that possibly putting on a VLAN or something, so it would mimic how it would be deployed in the real world. Then we actually go through the process of using it, set up that smart device and use it, connecting it with the mobile application, setting up accounts, generating data. And as we go through that data that we generate will then be able to be used when we do the security testing. Can we then access that data, whether it's on the device or being stored on up in the cloud, or on the mobile device unintentionally in the mobile application? So we'll be just observing what network devices is the IoT device communicating with, what web application and APIs are being used for transfer of data and interacting. Is there a mobile application or some other human machine interface that we're using to interact with the device? And then can you just through observation determine what wireless protocols are being used? Is it just 802.11 and Bluetooth, or are there some other radio frequency protocols being used? Frequently that will be on the outside of the device. Next, we go into passive reconnaissance and open source intelligence gathering. Examine the device. Many devices, especially in the United States, have to go through an FCC approval if they're working on radio frequency. That includes 802.11, Bluetooth. If they're emitting some sort of radio frequency, they have to be approved by the FCC. Each device is issued a identifying number, and you can then go on the internet with that FCC ID and find the documentation used for approval. These documents are posted online, and they have information about what radio frequency ranges the device is working on. They frequently have pictures of teardowns of the device. So before you even have to physically open the device yourself, you may be able to see into and identify, parts of the PCB on the internal device, possibly maybe what microcontroller they're using on it as well, and other device components. Is there any third-party integration with the device? So is that device, communicating? Is it able to integrate with other IoT ecosystems? Are there online manuals provided by the manufacturer? I have seen online manuals during testing that have provided me the information to gain access to the bootloader on the device. So people underestimate how much information manufacturers may be putting into their manuals that would end up actually, allowing for a major vulnerability. Default passwords, again, are very frequently printed in the manuals as well, and many companies still to this day leave these devices with the default passwords on their network. Are there previous versions of the device? If there are previous renditions of the device, were there vulnerabilities? Are there CVEs that you can then go and look up and determine, did they properly fix that issue? Or did, the fix for that issue possibly introduce a different problem? Are there other products by the same company? Because those products may have a vulnerability that has not yet been discovered on the device that you're looking at. Next, we go into security testing after we've gathered all that information in open source intelligence gathering. Security testing for IoT, we're going to be looking at the network. What web application and cloud APIs are we, connecting, is the device interacting with? Is there a mobile application component, or it may be like a machine interface, some other type of console that you'd be using to interact with the device? What wireless, that includes radio, possibly, is used to transmit data for the device? And then finally, we'll actually do testing of the device hardware itself. Network testing. Now, many penetration testers are very familiar and comfortable with network testing. We look for the common services and protocols. Are the communications being encrypted properly? Is there excessive ports on the device for some reason open? Two of the most common protocols that some pen testers may not be sort of comfortable with, or familiar with, are MQTT, which is just a network protocol that uses pretty much is meant for transmitting data. It's not, it's not meant for web connection thing, but it runs on low bandwidth and sends small packets. So it works very well in unreliable networks, and why it's frequently used in IoT. And then constrained application protocol, or CoAP, is another commonly used communication protocol for IoT devices, and it's actually the alternative to using HTTP for IoT. It is more reliable in that low bandwidth, low energy consumption, since it's using a smaller packet structure than HTTP does. And surprisingly enough, Metasploit does have a module for doing MQTT authorization, and MQTT is capable of doing encrypted communications, but many manufacturers may not be aware of that, or may not implement that when they're designing their device. So it's something to look for when you're doing network testing. Web application and APIs. So web applications for IoT frequently sort of fall into two different categories. They may be device-driven. Think of that multifunction printer that I mentioned earlier, where it's sitting on an internal network and it's not really meant to be exposed to the internet. Or many of the IoT devices for consumer use are internet-facing web applications. These are publicly out there. So again, when you're doing that functional testing, you may have to set up a device to do that, have that device-driven web application that would be sitting on a network, or you may be reaching out on the internet and looking at a web application that's being hosted, either by the company or possibly up in the cloud, like on Azure or AWS or something. And again, web application and APIs are something most security professionals are familiar with when it comes to security. We think OWASP top 10 for web apps and APIs. Injection testing, including cross-site scripting. SQL injection is a really common one, since many of these devices are storing large amounts of data up in either the cloud or on a server owned by the company that has designed the IoT device. That data is being collected in a SQL database. So SQL injection is definitely a vulnerability to be aware of. Business logic flaws. Now, I've seen on a number of IoT devices where the web application was vulnerable to a business logic flaw, where I could end up decommissioning like a ton of different sensors and it was not intended function of the web application. Default passwords, as I previously mentioned, are a frequent issue for IoT devices, including their web apps. Data exposure and authentication bypass, and then vulnerable third-party libraries are a frequently seen issue in the web applications in general, but also when we're looking at IoT. Next, we have mobile applications. Mobile applications are definitely more frequently used for consumer devices, but we do occasionally see them in corporate networks. They are usually used for remote management, although in consumer devices, they are also often used for initial setup and pairing of the device and connecting it to whatever wireless network the device might be communicating with. So paying attention not just when you're using the mobile application, but also during that initial setup, you may want to have two devices where you've done that functional testing and already set up the device, and then you actually go about setting up a new device, and during security testing, watching that pairing process and setup, since while the device may be using encryption once it's finally established, during the initial setup, we've found that sometimes manufacturers don't implement secure communications during the initial setup process. Again, OWASP has their mobile top 10, and some of the major ones that I think of when I think IoT are data storage. Again, IoT devices have a lot of information that they're transmitting. Is that data being stored on the mobile application? Since it's already communicating possibly up with the cloud, why would it be getting stored on the mobile? And is it being even securely stored on the mobile, or is it just in clear text on the device? Authentication and session handling are frequently an issue. Is the session identifier predictable? Is it being created by something that you could then automate and create a script to then identify other people's sessions and then gain access to them? Again, that sort of goes into authorization. And then cryptography. Are things being encrypted? Any information that's required to be stored on that mobile device, is it being properly encrypted and securely stored? Next, we come to wireless and RF, and this is definitely where I think this diverges for some testers. Many testers will be familiar with 802.11 wireless networks. They may even be familiar with Bluetooth and BLE, but this is where IoT starts to get a little bit more complex in that there are a vast array of radio frequency protocols in use and different protocols that different companies have developed for IoT devices. This includes Zigbee, LoRa. This next slide shows the just a handful of wireless protocols if you go start searching on the internet for IoT wireless. And each of them can have a slightly different use case. Zigbee and Z-Wave are very popular in sensors and think maybe like smart garage doors, areas where you need a low amount of energy, but it's short range communication, while LoRa is frequently used for long distance communication. ANT and Bluetooth are frequently seen in fitness, think like smart treadmills, your smart fitness device, watch, or heart rate monitor. That's where you're going to see ANT and Bluetooth. So each of these protocols may be getting used frequently in wireless testing on devices. You're going to see not just one of these, but possibly 2, 3, or more. But frequently, at least two different wireless protocols will be in use. Next, we come to the fun part, the part that I really enjoy, the device testing. And while it may seem a little bit iterative, we're going to start doing reconnaissance of the device. Again, look at the exterior device. You may have already noticed that FCC ID number and that model number, but again, just take a second look, make sure that you didn't miss any identifying things that might give you information about the device. How is the case of the device? Is it secure? Would it be, is it tamper evident? So if somebody were to open that device and then, do something to it maliciously and then put it back together, would it be, would somebody notice that? Or, could you disassemble the device, put on new firmware that would be malicious, or open a backdoor on the device and then put it back into production and nobody be the wiser? Using any information that you've gathered beyond what you've obtained on the device, again, go online, search for more information. Next, after opening the device, we'll do PCB analysis. And this is where we're going to start looking, are there identifying traces that we could tap into? What chipsets are on do the chips on the IoT device have the labeling still there, or has it been removed? If that labeling is still there, you can go look up online the chips, the identifying, numerical assigned to the chip and get the data sheets for it. These data sheets provide a wealth of information about functioning of the chip and can give you attack paths to the device. Does the chipset support encryption? How is information being stored? It provides you pinouts on the chip, so that you can then tap into that chip. And so looking at that data sheet, that information can help you when you're actually doing testing. Are there debug interfaces present? Whether the header pins are there or not on that device, identifying a debug interface and then being able to connect to it can provide you a huge amount of access. Frequently, UART, JTAG, other debug interfaces will allow you access to communicate with the device and provide a way to test without having to tap into chips. Again, be aware that there could be tamper seals on the chips. That includes gluing down of the chips, coatings on the chips, although frequently these are relatively easily bypassed using heat. You have to be careful about not damaging the chips, but you can usually get the tamper seals off the chips to then gain access. Now, I mentioned debug interfaces. There are a variety of debug interfaces that you can find on IoT devices, but these are some of the most common debug interfaces: JTAG, UART, serial debug, and SPI. Now, each of these could be defined as debug protocols or interfaces. Each of them we could have a whole talk about on their own, but interacting with debug interfaces usually requires another piece of hardware. At the bottom of my slide there is a bus pirate, which I am a very big fan of since of the low price point and the variety of interfaces that it can connect to. You can connect to JTAG, you can connect to UART. Up at the top there's the Atify badge, which is another relatively low price point, and it connects to a variety of debug interfaces. And on the right there, we have a Seger JLink Pro, which is great for connecting to JTAG and serial wire debug, but has a very high price point. And this is where IoT can become very expensive. Each of these different debug interfaces and even the chipsets themselves maybe have a better affinity for a certain device and communication for debugging. And frequently going online and looking up the chipsets that you're working with, you can find developers who are like, this device works best with this chipset. So having sort of an arsenal of different devices for connecting to debug is really great to have in that toolbox. But at the very beginning, I definitely recommend something that has a lower price point, like an Atify badge or a bus pirate or a Shikra from Exhibitor, so that you can connect to a variety of different debug interfaces. And again, these are usually just pass-throughs, although like the JLink has its own software attached to it, but they integrate with other command line tools to actually interact with debugging. Now, what are some of the device attacks and testing techniques? Dynamic analysis and fuzzing of the device while it's in a running state, which is why having access to debug is nice, although not always necessary. You may be able to tap into the chips and actually interact with the chip at its source by tapping into if they're exposed feet, or you've been able to get firmware off the device, which we'll be talking about here in a moment. You can often virtualize the device, and that can make that dynamic analysis and fuzzing a little bit easier. And this is where we're going to actually hook into the running processes of the device with something like GDB, and possibly start and stop and step through different processes and inject into it to see if we can cause faults, if we can bypass security. Other attacks, which some of these are really cool attacks, but they take a lot of time, and that's something to be aware of when you're sort of determining how much what is the scope and time frame for a project. Side channel attacks. These are attacks where you're looking at not necessarily injecting, but observing the power consumption or the clock timing on the device to then identify areas that you could then collect information and break that the cryptography that's protecting the data that's being transmitted. Fault injection and glitching attacks, we're intentionally sending faults into the system to bypass security measures. And then interchip communications, where we're going and tapping into the communications between chips on the board, because while the device may be sending data encrypted outside, at some point in that system, frequently that information is being decrypted, and can we tap into it and identify and capture clear text data, or at least keys that we can then use to decrypt traffic? I would be remiss if I didn't mention the magic smoke when I'm talking about device testing. Now, I mentioned removing, tamper seals and stuff. When we're dealing with devices, we are dealing with, frequently applying heat when we're soldering or connecting to the chips. And the magic smoke is what is let out when you fry a chip. It is, and that's at that point your device is dead. And this is why I previously mentioned the idea of having two devices, but it really is, I cannot emphasize how important when you are doing device testing, you want to get to have that full functional environment, but you also want to be able to tear down the device. And you do risk then ruining all your work when you start doing that teardown if you don't have an extra device on hand. So don't let the magic smoke out, or at the very least have two devices. Now, device extracting firmware. Dumping via debug interface is one option if we have debug available. Extracting from the chip while it's still in circuit on the device, or in some cases, we may need to remove the chip from the board itself. And that's why having a soldering rig is a really important thing. You remove the chip from the device, and then place it into a reader in most cases. On the left there, we have the TL8662 Plus, and there's a little SOP8 chip that we then use the XPro software that's associated with that chip reader to extract the firmware. Or there are cases where you don't have a reader that'll accommodate the chip you have. On the right, there was an MCU that I had removed from a board, and I did not have the appropriate reader. So I did what is known as dead bugging. And dead bugging is, and this is why having those data sheets is so important, you identify what, so that's where we tap into the chip and use solder wire onto points on the ball grid array where the device is actually transmitting the chip data and powering that chip, and then we can connect it to a debugging device to extract firmware. In some cases, as I mentioned, you are limited on the number of devices you have available to you. On one test, I needed the device still running, but I needed to extract firmware, and this was my answer to this. That is 24 gauge wire that I first removed the chip, then soldered wire back to connect it to the board, and I did have the device back in a running state. So have two devices on hand, or be very good at soldering. That required a huge amount of patience, and a lot of people thought I was pretty nutty for doing it, but it ended up looking really cool. Finally, once we've extracted that firmware, we're going to do firmware and analysis. We're going to use command line tools like binwalk to extract the firmware, and binwalk will provide you some, initial information around the file system of the device. As you can see in the screenshot, it identified a squashfs file system. There also JFFS2 file system, and something about binwalk to be aware of is that you may have it available already on your Linux machine, but it may not have all the packages necessary. Like JFFS2 file system, I had to go grab packages, and they're available on GitHub, but it can sometimes be problematic actually extracting some of the embedded hardware, embedded firmware, because binwalk and your other tools may not have full support for them right out of the package when you install Linux. So going through that file system, going and looking for, are there keys? Are there like API keys? Can we find sensitive information about the device, about the passwords, whether that's passwords to gain access to accounts or gain access to the wireless network that it's connecting to. So going through the file system and looking for sensitive information, we can also throw that firmware there then into a disassembler and doing static analysis. Can we find, vulnerable functions that we can then develop, inject into? And there are automated analysis tools for firmware analysis, but frequently these do have a very hefty license price tag attached to them, but they are very cool. I've gotten to use one of them, Centrifuge. It does all this analysis and provides you information about like the cryptographic, the strength of the cryptography on the device and everything. So these, firmware analysis is sort of a multi-step process of looking at things at the command line and just grepping, putting it in a disassembler and looking at the code of the firmware itself. Finally, once we've done all this testing, we're going to then look at, what are the different task packs that we have identified. Has, some information that's come out, like when you're looking at the firmware, informed further testing that we need to do. Looking at the IoT ecosystem as a whole to determine where we need to remediate and improve its security. Now, this is the fun part. I love helping teach people about IoT and testing and getting hands-on. So where do you get started in doing IoT testing? What do you need to begin? I highly recommend a good soldering station and obviously the associated consumable supplies that you will need, like different gauges of soldering wire, solder wick, flux. Chip quick is really nice for when you're removing chips. Magnifying equipment. You are dealing with very tiny components. At the very least, a good magnifying glass, but ideally, if you can get a microscope, even just a hand-me-down somewhere, it will make it far easier when you're trying to identify what are the identifying markers on that chip, because it is so tiny. If you need to, I have used my smartphone and taken a picture and then blown the picture, zoomed in on the picture to be able to get that information. A multimeter. Multimeters are great for identifying, ground, identifying the pinout, what, you can determine which pins are interacting with other components on the board, where that, where the lines are going with a multimeter. A logic analyzer. We talked about debug. In some cases, you may not be able to identify what the chipset is. Having a logic analyzer will allow you to decode what debug may be being used for, whether that's UART or JTAG. A chip reader like a TL8662 Plus or some other chip reader that comes with a variety of different adapters. So not all chips are the same. You have SOP 8s, you have NAND flashes. Make sure that you're buying a chip reader that can adapt to different uses. Devices interface with debug over USB, which we already talked about, like a bus pirate or an exhibitor Shikra or a Segre J-Link. And then what devices do you get started on? Now, there are a number of different ways you can go about this. You can look at off-brand devices, because while it may be really cool to look at that Ring doorbell, that's a very hefty price tag to buy two and then tear one apart. So go look online. There are many sort of different renditions of those devices where you can buy them for significantly cheaper and feel a lot less, like you're losing a lot of money when you're tearing them apart. Companies going out of business. Now, when companies either move or they're closing, they will sell off those devices for relatively low cost. What's cool is that hopefully they're deleting the information on those devices, like any stored keys or passwords for connecting to their network. If you find them and they did delete it, that's an issue with the device in itself. But you may have data already on the device. Again, thrift stores are in that sort of same situation where you're getting that device it's used. It may still have data, but it's a nice price point. And then throwaway devices. Now, these are the devices we did our RSA hands-on labs focused on these, where they have a short lifespan, but they've been designed to connect. Think like smart light bulbs. That light bulb's eventually going to burn out. So the price point on them is a lot lower, and you can buy a whole bunch of them for a relatively reasonable cost. Now, how do you learn about IoT testing? I highly recommend my coworker, Daryl Highland. He's the head of our IoT research. On the Rapid7 blogs, he has a whole series. He does have an introduction how to get started, which will list out many of the items that I have already recommended that you get to start with IoT testing. But he also has a four-part series on doing extraction of firmware from different devices and using different techniques. So just jumping in and learning and reading about that and being able to possibly even get get similar devices and go through the process yourself. When it comes to doing things like reverse engineering and going after the firmware, I highly recommend Azaria Labs tutorials. She has a whole introduction on how to read ARM assembly language, and then goes into actually learning about how to identify, do attacks against it. Their OWASP does, which I've mentioned a number of times, does have an open source project for learning about IoT. It's called IoT Goat, and it is a relatively new project from when I last saw it on GitHub. And they have even a bunch of hints on the different types of vulnerabilities you're going to find on it. So this is what's great is this is free. It's open source, and it's something that you set up on, it's virtualized. The downside is you don't get to do the physical hardware portion of the IoT testing, but it will introduce you to the actual, going through firmware and stuff. Then finally, training. Training does cost money, other than like the openly free available stuff online, like people's blogs. I highly recommend New AE's technology training on side channel. They do a whole training on Chip Whisperer, which is the owner, Colin O'Flynn, created, and it's used for side channel attacks and glitching and fault injection testing. Azaria Labs does have training as well around attacking both IoT and then more focused on ARM. I have taken a workshop with her, so I can speak to New AE and Azaria Labs as fabulous training experiences. Now, I recommend Joe Grand's Hardware Hacking Basics because I have had friends and coworkers who have taken his. There's also Adify has their training as well, which you can do remotely. Joe Grand's I know does his training yearly at Black Hat, but I do believe he does some smaller trainings throughout the year. It's been a pleasure presenting to you, and I would be happy to take questions now about IoT testing.